Every American is familiar with the assassination of America's 16th president, Abraham Lincoln. The details of the event have become an indelible part of our history, but many are unfamiliar with the series of events leading up to and following Lincoln's death. Booth didn't act alone. He was assisted by a larger group of conspirators. One of them was Mary Surratt, whose prosecution would go down as one of the most important and controversial trials in American history. She's the topic of tonight's Real History.
Americans have been taught that Abraham Lincoln's assassination was the product of one man, John Wilkes Booth, and that it was his lone idea to kill the president, when in fact it was a conspiracy. There were 8 co-conspirators in the plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. Mary Surratt was one of the co-conspirators, and her story has been lost to history. Mary Surratt met John Wilkes Booth through her son, John Surratt. One day, John brought John Wilkes Booth to their boarding house in Washington, D.C., and Mary's home was a welcome home for Confederate sympathizers and rebels and spies. And it was at this boarding house that John Wilkes Booth came to visit, and Mary Surratt welcomed him into her boarding house, and it was there that he would spend months meeting privately with Mary. She's an older woman, and he takes her opinion very seriously, and he finds her very, very supportive. Mary's Southern sympathies, her great intelligence drew her into John Wilkes Booth's web to create this plot to kidnap and then assassinate Abraham Lincoln. John Wilkes Booth believed in the cause of the South triumphing during the Civil War, and he knew that the South was losing, and the only way he felt he could effect change was to kill the president. On the day of the assassination, Mary Surratt travels to her tavern in Maryland and makes arrangements with the tavern keeper to have certain items ready for John Wilkes Booth: guns, ammunition, and items that he's going to need for his ride, including whiskey, and she also brings some field glasses so that he can use them when he's on the run and hiding out after he's assassinated Lincoln. Booth successfully assassinates Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater about 10 o'clock Friday evening, Good Friday. Chaos after this happens, complete chaos. On April 17th, Monday evening, the Union Army arrives at Mary's boarding house in Washington, D.C., and they start searching the house again for evidence. While they're there, one of the co-conspirators, Lewis Payne, shows up at the door, and he has a lame excuse that he's there to dig a ditch for Mrs. Surratt. Mary doesn't let on who he is, and the Union officers are very suspicious. So they arrest him and they arrest Mary, and the whole story begins to unravel. And Mary lies during her interrogation, which only makes it worse for herself, and her lies end up making her a prime suspect in the assassination plot. Andrew Johnson, the president, decided that they would try the conspirators in a military tribunal, and this was very controversial. Attorney General James Speed handed down a decision arguing that it was appropriate to try citizens in a military tribunal because these citizens had acted as combatants, that the country was still basically at war. Even though the war had supposedly ended, there were still units fighting out in the field. And they felt that these 8 conspirators had been determined to carry out an act of war by assassinating Abraham Lincoln. The conspirators were vilified in the press. Mary suffered greatly. They described her as an Amazon, but she was only about 5'4" and maybe weighed 140 pounds. They said that she looked like a criminal, that she had beady little eyes and thin lips. 4 of the co-conspirators are found guilty and sentenced to hang, including Mary Surratt. The other 4 co-conspirators are given varying sentences in prison. On the day of the execution, Mary and the other co-conspirators who were set to be hanged had to listen to the gallows being built right outside their cells, and the drop that had to be adjusted, slapped shut and open repeatedly so that they could have perfect timing. Mary marched out with the 3 other co-conspirators, practically carried up the steps by Union officers and a local priest who stood by her. Each of the co-conspirators needed to have their legs and wrists tied. And with Mary, that posed a bit of a problem for the hangman. Witnesses described when he came to Mary, he hesitated, and immediately people understood why he was hesitating, because it was so awkward to bend down and tie her legs. He had never hanged a woman before. If you recall, this was a Victorian era period, and women were held in esteem. Mary Surratt was the first woman executed by the federal government. The public is shocked when she's actually hanged. Up until the day of the hanging, most people were in favor of her hanging, but after it had happened, the public sentiment changed, and Mary Surratt became a victim of the government rather than the sense of vengeance had been fulfilled. After the trial and conviction of the 8 co-conspirators and the hanging of 4 of them, there was such a controversy over the way the trial had been conducted because it was a military trial, and the press really stirred up the sentiment, and no one felt that they had the desire to try to convict many more people that were suspected of aiding Booth and other co-conspirators in their plot. So many of those people spent months in jail and eventually were let out, and slowly the story was forgotten.